Hi, everyone. Welcome to Us and Flux Conversations from the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. My name's Bob Beard. I'm project manager at the center, where we use the tools of speculative fiction to get people thinking more optimistically about the future. And optimism, we could probably use some of that right now. Us and Flux is our response to the strange times that we're living in. Each week, we publish a short story that explores the themes of community, collaboration, and collective imagination in response to transformative events. And then we host a public discussion to go deeper into these topics. Our first story was published last Thursday, a really elegant and amazing story about food systems and farming called The Parable of the Tares by Christopher Rowe. Christopher is an educator, an elected official, and writer whose stories have been reprinted and translated around the world. He's the author of the acclaimed short story collection, or story collection, Telling the Map, as well as a middle grade series, The Supernormal Sleuthing Service. We're thrilled to have him pen the first story in this series and join us here today. And when we were talking about the kind of story that Christopher wanted to develop, we started thinking about the social and ecological impacts of very, very large-scale farming. If you've read the story, you know what we're talking about. If not, we'll get into it in just a bit. To help us think through these ideas, we reached out to Michael Bell. Michael is chair and Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Community and Environmental Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he's also a faculty associate in Environmental Studies, Religious Studies, and Agroecology. Mike was really game to jump on a call and join this conversation, start imagining and co-creating this vision of the future that we're really excited about. And that conversation was incredibly inspiring and got us to where we are today. So with that, let's just jump right in. Michael, Christopher, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, so Christopher, can you start by just telling us a little bit about the Parable of the Tares and what inspired your story?
Are you talking about the Parable of the Tares, the story, or the Parable of the Tares in Matthew 13?
Well, I mean, we could start with the New Testament.
You know, I was thinking about this afternoon. I think I can speak more intelligently to my own story. There, depending on how you count them, there are between 30 and 40 parables in the Synoptic Gospels, and I can't be sure that I understand a damn one of them. So I'll talk more about my own story.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, for those who haven't heard that expression. I just make sure folks know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is the Synoptic Gospels.
Right. So I have been thinking about monocultures for a long time. Monocultures, if you haven't read the story or if you're not familiar with the term, Michael will, I'm sure, educate us more about it, are very large single crop areas. They are the product of, they're pretty much the product of industrial agriculture. They've been an aim of agriculture on smaller scales, probably for 8,000 or 10,000 years, but you know, they've never really enjoyed the success that they enjoy now because they've never enjoyed industrial agriculture, and scientific endeavor has never been turned to crop production in quite the manner that it has been in the last 85 to 100 years. And I wanted to write a story about, the word itself interests me. The word monoculture itself interests me, you know, one culture, because cultures are not one thing. Ezra Pound said you need about 600 people to make a culture. And you need more than 600 plants to make a monoculture. So that frisson, that difference of what the words actually mean and what they say was always of interest to me. And so this project came along, and I had some ideas. I had some sketched out ideas. And then, as you mentioned, this wonderful conversation we had with Michael, who basically gave me the story on a plate. He said something at one point. I don't know whether we talk about spoilers in this kind of environment or not, but essentially he just said, what if it talks back to her? And I was like, oh, well, okay, you've just given me a short story. So, you know, that's how it came about.
It's great. And Michael, agroecology is a concept that's at the heart of Christopher's story. So could you talk a little bit about what that means and how it relates to the Parable of the Tares?
Yeah, so I think for the longest time, we kind of thought of agriculture as this thing that was removed and by itself, and it was something technical, and it's all separated from the rest of us, and probably very much part of, if I may say, bourgeois civilization, is that we just like put all that stuff off in another area of our life, and we don't even think about it. It's like you even see it today in the discussions about COVID-19. It's like what we still seem to be having this problem of food comes from the store, doesn't it? And I was even reflecting the other day about, I don't know if you saw the wonderful speech by the Queen about the situation in Britain, and they had all these little videos of new heroes of British society. So they were people loading boxes from loading platforms to trucks, and medical people and all that too, right? But no vision of where that actually came from, the stuff that people were loading. So it's like, oh my goodness, okay, we've got to contextualize that agriculture is something that people do, right? Mm-hmm. In an ecological situation. And hopefully it is not just by people, but it's also for people and for ecology as well. I think that's really the essence of the agroecological vision. A lot of people have worried that there isn't a kind of a social thing, like a agri-social ecology, if you know what I mean in that word, because it isn't just about putting ecology and agriculture together, but also understanding that this is a human act too. And there has been some concern that the word doesn't maybe instantly convey that, unless we remember that agriculture is something that people do, and that we are also part of ecology.
Great.
So let's not have a separatist view of agriculture as something that's removed someplace else, but that it's fully part of our lives, very close to our hearts, at least 3 times a day. You know, I think it's just a couple of inches from the heart.
And of course, civilization is made out of agriculture. I mean, you're an expert in both religion and agriculture, and those two things are kind of spoiled up out of various places around the world. Most famously the Fertile Crescent, but also Central America, Mesoamerica, also parts of China. And these simultaneous revolutions of humanity occurred when somebody figured out how to plant seeds and store the result. And go ahead.
Yeah, no, and it was really great to see you bring a kind of a New Testament reference into to this story, because religious traditions used to think about agriculture and sustenance needs much more part of what they do. But Jesus doesn't talk to farmers. Jesus doesn't talk about agriculture. The Buddha doesn't either. So these are traditions that emerged with the growth of great growth of cities in the late Iron Age, and the rise of empires at that time. And they're really addressing concerns about desire, both monetary desire and sexual desire, and how problems emerge from that. But they're really reflecting on issues of class society that are associated with the great growth of cities and centralization that happens at that time. And the rural gets seen as this negative, pagan, bad thing where backward people are, which we then exploit. And so, I mean, it's not exclusively that. There are ways that, for example, Christianity has long reached out to rural folks, but that's not at the heart of the tradition. So it was really great to see you bring a kind of a synoptic gospel vibe into this story.
Thank you. You were talking about the images in the Queen's speech. The most striking image I saw this week, I don't know whether you saw it or not, and it floated across my feed when a friend of mine posted it on some social media, was of 4 tanker trucks slowly driving through a field, spraying milk out onto the ground. because the distribution system for raw milk or dairy in general in this country has been overwhelmed from two different directions. They couldn't fulfill personal demand when the grocery store rushes happened. And then their biggest customers, hospitals, hotels, restaurant chains, and everything, shut down. So there's all this milk. I'm from a dairy farming family. There's all this milk all over the country that is being essentially destroyed because there's no way to get it to consumers, because the systems that existed for the two-way system, and it's more multifarious than that, but the systems that existed to distribute it were incapable of reacting to the current crisis in a way that could serve everyone that wanted milk or who did not want milk anymore. And that's a terrible thing to see.
I was just going to say, Christopher, I think your story speaks to this vulnerability that we get when we have such concentrated supply situations. Mm-hmm. When the agriculture is local and it's more diverse, you're much more able to respond to the situation. I know you're reading about the issue with, I'm from Wisconsin, a dairy state, so yeah.
Sure.
I've been reading all the things that you've been talking about. I have a friend who's a dairy farmer, and she's been telling me about how they're getting directives from the Department of Agriculture about how to dispose of your milk on your farm. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we're seeing challenges to meat supply lines too, because, you know, a worker gets ill and then other people don't want to show up there. And also meat slaughtering involves a lot of handwork with people very close together. But on Thursday last week, I got some grass-fed meat from a local farmer who delivered it right to my door. Right. So, and I'm fortunate because I live in Wisconsin in a relatively small city. We have these connections. Mm-hmm. But when Smithfield Food shuts down the largest pork packing plant in the country that supplies 5% of the country's pork, as they did yesterday. Maybe you read about this. Yeah. If you're living in the middle of Manhattan or in the Bronx or something of that sort, it's not going to be easy for you to get some pork like I did from the farmer I got it from on
Not at all. A couple of weeks ago, I was looking for I was sourcing eggs, which is not, again, I'm like you, I'm in a small university town. There's lots of agriculture all around us. So I was talking to some friends of mine that I knew through my government work about places to find hen eggs. And I found a source for duck eggs. And this lady wanted, I think, $15 for 60 or something like that, duck eggs. And I'd never cooked with duck eggs. And so I was, you know, kind of randomly talking online about how, you know, what's it like? You know, should I buy these duck eggs or not? And a friend of mine who lives in San Francisco, which is, of course, one of the most challenging places for anybody to live in the world right now, said, you know, our CSA had duck eggs. They were, I could get 6 for $12. I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
So I do want to, I do want to just remind our audience that there is an opportunity for them to submit questions down in the bottom of your screen. So we will get to those towards the end of our discussion. The two of you have, you know, touched on, farming and agriculture in history and religion, and then, you know, now talking about these sort of precarious situations that we're in with supply chains. And I think about, to your point, Michael, that like the science fiction scholar Theodore Sturgeon said, you know, science fiction stories are really just about humans in a technological system, right? And so I wonder, because, you know, farming is this highly skilled, highly technical vocation, but it's not a focus in science fiction, what are we losing when we're not talking about rural spaces in the future? And that's for both of you.
That's a really great question. I think one of the things that I'm so glad that you referred to farming as a highly skilled profession, because I'm just reflecting, for example, the way today our president has asked for H-2A workers to get a lower minimum wage. I don't know if you saw that. That's the procedure for workers to come in for agricultural work from places like, say, Mexico, because the assumption is that it's low skilled work, and it's also quite low. It's not low skill, it's low paid, right? And it's not low technology, it's low paid. And one of the things that we also fail to understand is that that poverty has a very strong rural bias. That's true all over the world. It's some 85%, according to the UN, of those who are defined as poor are from rural areas. The gap isn't as wide in the US, but we think we have this very urban image of what poverty is, but it's actually higher in the United States and in Europe in rural areas. And I think that inequality maybe collides with a notion of technology, because technology is a symbol of wealth. And so then we assume culturally, we make this association and we don't even notice we're doing it.
I'm very familiar from my childhood, not personally, I rush to say, but with not just rural poverty, but rural hunger, which is, especially for young people, really young people, is an extraordinary and disheartening thing to witness when you're surrounded by fields of crops. And there are people you're going to school with who are clearly malnourished, you know. Again, that goes back to distribution, that goes back to social inequalities, that goes back to, I don't know. I'd not heard that news that you said about the president and the agro workers, the migrant agro workers. That's pretty pathetic. That's you know, there's undocumented workers are absolutely essential to the food system in this country. I mean, from picking peppers in the Central Valley to processing chickens on the Delmarva Peninsula. You know, there are undocumented workers at every step along the way, from the person who pulls the plant to the ground to the person who processes it and cooks it for you and puts it on the plate and then puts it on the restaurant table. You know, there are undocumented workers along that entire chain, and it is absolutely, I don't know what the word I'm looking for. It's specious to suggest that they're not required, or that they're not important, or that they're a threat somehow. You know, when our way of life is dependent on this exploitation. I mean, we're kind of getting far afield of this particular story in agriculture and so on, but that is something that I'm passionate about. It's I don't know. I wish people would think, I'm like you, Michael, I wish people would think more about what they're consuming, in anything they're consuming, but especially food. I wish they thought about where it came from. You know, I was thinking a second ago, and I'm kind of driving us off the cliff here, but when you were talking about the Queen and the Queen's heroes, I was remembering the victory gardens of World War II, World War I and World War II in England. And those types of efforts still exist, but they exist largely, to my knowledge, in totalitarian states. The truck garden, the idea of a village producing as much food as they can for themselves and for the nearby cities, because of vulnerable transportation systems, vulnerable distribution systems, systems that have to do with international trade, tariffs, all this kind of stuff. Large states, large totalitarian states, seem to be smarter about, I mean, they don't care as much about feeding their people, but I don't know, but they seem to be smarter about feeding their people. than some Western democracies are. Although some Western democracies are great. France and Germany have great agriculture systems. They're so tied up in the labor movements, though, that it makes more sense that they.
Yeah, I don't know how much of an association there is between totalitarian states and the popularity of people having plots of land outside the city, as it's maybe peculiar to the U.S. that we don't do it very much. I'm just reflecting in Britain, where having an allotment is still a very powerful, important thing. And as you say, in Germany, many people have plots there. But anyway, I just want to go back to your earlier point about labor and devaluing of labor, because I feel like your story speaks very clearly to this, and that it presents what seems like a kind of a utopia in which there is no agricultural labor, right? There's just like two people. There's Simeon and
for the state of Kansas.
Dana, was Dana supposed to be a play on DNA, by the way? The logo.
No, actually, I don't know where that name came from. I think I came up with it because I wanted the rhyme with banana. It was a joke.
Oh, you're on Dan and banana. Because I was like, oh, he must mean DNA somehow there. Something like that.
Yes, it was DNA. You're correct, sir. That's what I was thinking the entire time.
But anyway, so it's like speaking to this, to labor as a problem that we need to get rid of.
Yeah.
And then getting rid of the people and the processes, and then that's just wrong. This work can be wonderfully fulfilling, and we have many young people we have a master's program in agroecology here at the university, and it's young people are taking the program, and they delight in the direct engagement with ecology, with life, and with other people that food allows. So yeah, I don't think we want to get rid of agricultural labor unless you're an urban capitalist and you're looking for cheap workers, and you're looking for ways to maintain. Well, actually, I mean, so many of the world's urban poor are actually the recently rural.
Yeah.
And they've come to work for almost nothing, to do lousy work because of the way we structured our economy. It's terrible.
There's a strain in, should I say American science fiction? There's a strain in American science fiction. It's not as prevalent as it used to be, but it's called post-scarcity. Are you familiar with this term? There are some pretty good writers that work in this field, although I find it repulsive because it basically promotes these views of the world. And I guess Star Trek, the original Star Trek television show is post-scarcity because there is no want, there's no money, there's no, if you want some food, you go to the wall and you push a button and some food comes out.
Yeah.
And the idea that the thing that frustrates me so much about that is, where are the miners? Who is cleaning up after you when you finish eating this? Where did this food come from? And these unexamined questions and these glorious, glittering futures just frustrate the time out of me. Because first off, like you said, that the work is valuable. The work is actually it's valuable personally. I mean, anybody who has a garden and successfully grows a tomato, that's a spiritual act, to get back to our religious stuff. And the that kind of human nature connection is lost, I think, in urban capitalism and in Star Trek.
I wanted to get at that a little bit, because this story it focuses on Dana. And she's this seemingly solitary character, but really, like, if you dig deeper into the story, this is all about sort of communities, right? Like her heritage, her human and machine coworkers, the activists that recruited her. So I wondered if you might talk about sort of the idea of how this community and collectivism plays against the idea of, you know, the monoculture, which is, you know, surrounds Dana.
Well, one thing that I want to make sure that people recognize, or that I don't want anyone to take away from the story, the idea that Dana is some kind of chosen one. I really wanted to push hard, and I used the phrase twice, on the tens of thousands. I wanted to make sure that, because of the brevity of the story, I couldn't have tens of thousands of characters, but I did want her to be representative of a larger community that is discrete and small and working counter to the larger culture and what the larger culture believes its best interest to be, right? Both from a government and technocratic level and even from a consumer level. And in terms of the community that she is part of, I don't know, I think she's lonely, obviously, out there in the fields, but I think that she has this communication. There are two, in the story, one of them never speaks, but there are two very large non-human systems, I guess, that play very strong roles in the story. And that meeting of the minds between Dana and one of them on the page and the other not on the page is exemplary of other strains of science fiction that get into what I sometimes call the cosmic bullshit, when you get into, like, you know, a human level intelligence encountering something so different and so large that, you know, you can't comprehend it. But I'm more interested in humans than I am in artificial intelligences or even intelligent crops. And so I try to make Dana sympathetic, certainly, although what she's doing is very complicated. What she and the tens of thousands of people are doing is very complicated. It is, I tried to present a difficult ethical and moral choice that she doesn't have that much trouble making, but I hope readers have trouble deciding whether she did the right thing or not, you know, whether it succeeds or not. You know, I also left it kind of up in the air about whether or not what they're doing could in any way impact, you know, impact their larger world.
Yeah. So
is amber a reference to amber waves of grain?
Yes.
Okay.
Excellent.
And the wolf theme in there, was that speaking to community?
Are you talking about the character's name?
Lobos, and then Lopez is a version of wolf.
Yeah.
Too.
Well, Lopez and Lobos are, you know, related. One of my favorite professional bicyclists is a guy named Louis V. Lobos, and so I just kind of used his name.
Okay.
But the lone wolf, but yes, the idea of a lone wolf and a pack animal and that tension between different kinds of wolves and stuff is, yeah, that's absolutely present. That's on the page there, sure.
Okay, cool.
So at the end of the story, for folks that maybe didn't read the story, and it's 1,500 words, and it's been out since Thursday. Come on, guys. And you're stuck at home. But at the end of the story, Dana plants an interloper seed within the monoculture. And Michael, I think you said it earlier, right? Like, you know, these small acts of self-reliance, you know, like planting a garden is a spiritual act, you know, and I also want to get into it if we have time. You're both involved in local politics. So how are these sort of, you know, small acts of self-reliance, how are these spiritual? How are these radical acts?
Well, I just loved the notion of her grandmother being sentenced for sedition and seed saving, which I didn't know if that was supposed to be also a pun on seed dition or not, but at any rate.
I mean, I just like the way words sound together sometimes.
Okay. But the whole notion of seed saving as a radical act that is punishable by the state, and how she's responding to that, I found very emotionally powerful. I love that part of the story.
Thank you.
So I don't know if that doesn't really exactly answer your question, but this is a very political story, I think, in that sense, and it's about the state, I think, but also about the alliance of the state and capital, right? I mean, because we don't quite hear in the story where the money, how money is moving around, whether there even is money or whether the food just shows up. But one presumes if you're having a monoculture, you're also having a monoeconomy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Dana is resisting her seed addition, is resisting that as well. At least I took that from it.
Sure, and she's
that, Christopher, but it wasn't just smash the state, but smash capital.
So before we get into questions, and we do have some questions from the audience, so I want to make sure that we have time for that. And if you do have a question, go ahead and put it down into the Q&A. You know, I do want to ask, you know, maybe like, why did Dana plant? Why did Dana plant the seed? You know, just to put a very fine point on it, Christopher. What do you think, and Michael?
Wait, who are you asking?
Either one, but yeah, go ahead, Christopher.
I do want to say that in that the idea of the interloper seed, in terms of where she is, Andromeda Girardi is not the interloper. The monocrop is the interloper. I mean, that is tall. The Flint Hills are tall grass prairie country, you know, or prairie grass country. So she's bringing something back. In a sense, my friend Ted Chiang describes science fiction that returns, or fantasy especially, that returns the status quo to an earlier state is inherently conservative. And I'd read an interview with him recently where he said that. And so I wanted to turn that a little bit on its head. I wanted to present a state where I wanted to present a story or present a fictive situation where returning to an earlier state is actually the radical act, you know, because conservation and conservatism have such tangled up, you know, there's so much philosophical tangling in those two terms that we have been robbed of, because we have been robbed of nuance in this country. And the reason she does it, Lord, there are lots of reasons she does it. I mean, she's got family reasons, she's got scientific reasons, because she's a trained agronomist. She knows the monoculture cannot last. So maybe she wants to introduce its death or fulfill its death wish in a controlled fashion, you know. Maybe she wants to. I'm saying maybe. Some of the viewers might be surprised to learn that creators often do not know all of the answers to every question about their own work. But she does it. Why does she do it? Michael?
Well, I mean, I felt, okay, there's certainly the legacy and the history there, and the notion of a seed is carrying a biological heritage, but also is carrying a social heritage, right from her grandmother, and all those connecting links going back to community. But also she's fulfilling what the crop has asked her to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and for me, it was like that. It was there in her mind that she might have done this, but it's the crop that actually induces her to actually act on that.
Right. She's, in a sense, she's like a Cold War novel mole that's been planted by this, you know, separatist group or whatever, as are all the tens of thousands. But in a larger sense, you know, we do not know what she would have done if this extraordinary event, this liminal, you know, this sublime thing had not happened, where the crop that she simultaneously serves and is meant to subvert enters itself into the conversation. You know, it enters itself into the dialogue of what it should be and what it can be and what it should not be. and she acts on that. You know, she makes a decision. She makes a human decision that she's been preparing for and has been prepared for, certainly, that it is ultimately her decision to do it.
Yeah, one of our attendees made a comment just saying that they enjoyed how the monoculture didn't just communicate with Dana, but also the way that it was described to acknowledge her physical presence by opening in front of her and closing behind her when she did go out. So there is, like, you know, we talk about community a lot, right? There's an element of like this interspecies community and the sort of the sovereignty of natural ecosystems, and that we're all a part of that nature. So
absolutely,
yeah, that's great. Are we game to, you know, answer some questions?
Sure.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So Andrew Hudson asks, recently I read your story, The Contra Gardener, and he's wondering how you see that agricultural future connecting or in contrast to the agricultural future in the story for the Us in Flux series.
The Contra Gardener is a short story I wrote 4 or 5 years ago. Another agriculture story, although it has an urban setting. It's set in and around the future Kentucky Derby, which is obviously, you know, happens in Louisville, Kentucky, which is a large city. That's more about the tension between horticulture and agriculture, I think. I mean, the agricultural aspects of that story, which are not the most important aspects of that story to me, those aspects of it that have to do with growing food have more to do with small scale and large scale as a means of looking at both family relationships between that character in Contra Gardener and her father, and the relationships between smallholders and large landholders, or I guess peasants and capitalists, in a sense. I write about farms and farmers because I grew up on a farm, and they're not necessarily explicitly connected any more or any less than all of my work is explicitly connected to one another, one piece to the other.
Mm-hmm. So this is a question from Chinello Anwalu. Hi, Chinello. The true worth of agricultural workers can be seen even historically, where slaves in the US who had knowledge of farming and cooking were always sold at higher prices than others. So the question is, how can we tap into the knowledge base of these workers to make modern industrial farming practices, much of which is so unsustainable and destructive, more sustainable and eco-friendly?
Well, I think there's an important element of language that I would love to see shifted a little bit. One of the things that there's been a lot of work in the agricultural community on recently to change is the image that we have that a farmer is male. And there's been quite, you used to have expressions like farmer and farm wife, for example. And the phrase farm wife is now finally kind of disappearing. And now we've changed the census now. So the census of agriculture includes farms to list up to 3 primary operators. And so you can get a lot more diversity in the sense of who is the farmer. But there's another area that we really have not pushed on, is the sense that we have farmers and then we have farm workers. So I think that if you're a farmer, you do work. And if you are a farm worker, you are farming. And so that's another safe place where we're really devaluing a lot of the labor that's involved. And we have a sense of the farmer is the person with the capital. And so you see capitalist relations, the person who has access to the land because they have the money to buy it or to rent it becomes the farmer, and everyone else is a farm worker. And I think if we could break that down, so these folks are all farming and are farmers, but some people have organized the land holding. And that's one of the things that people do to make agriculture happen, but that's only one of the things. Then we would really, I think, open up our appreciation of all the work that's involved.
I'm going to attack that from a slightly different direction. I think one of the lies that capitalists tell is about where the expertise lies in a system. And in farming, labor and expertise are inextricable. The person who does hard physical labor is also the storehouse of the expertise in how that crop is grown, moved, distributed, eaten, everything. And in terms of the historical valuing of enslaved peoples who had that expertise more than other enslaved peoples who had maybe had other expertises or less expertise, yes, that is absolutely true. That goes, I mean, have you guys ever been to Monticello, Jefferson's estate? And it's the same with Washington too, but you know, this great landed baron, Thomas Jefferson, with all his experiments and all his expertise and everything, he's so overvalued in terms of what he accomplished in the sciences, because everything he accomplished, especially in agriculture, he just like went outside and asked a guy that he happened to own, you know, and systematized it and wrote it down. I mean, I guess that's his contribution, if it can be said to be. But in terms of now, though, and in valuing expertise and in using that expertise to undermine, attack, or facilitate change in the way that industrial agriculture works, that's a big challenge. It's a huge challenge, because the fact of the matter is we do have 7 billion people we need to feed, you know? And the expertise that exists on these scales, I mean, I look out the window, a block and a half away, there are various community gardens that people work in and teach each other things in, all that kind of stuff. But I don't know how to transfer the expertise that, in my case, my neighbors who are from the Congo have about growing certain pepper plants that they have shared with me. I don't know how to transfer that to in a scheme that feeds millions and millions of people. I hope that there is a way, and I'm even confident that there's stuff there to be learned. But we're a long way into capitalism, man, and we're a long way into industrial agriculture, and we're a long way into Malthusian population growth. So I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a very interesting question. It's a very important question.
I think another important dimension of the question is that it points to how labor relations within agriculture are highly racialized.
Oh yeah. Oh hell yeah.
Whether you're talking in the US or whether you're talking, say, the way apartheid worked in South Africa and actually continues to work in many ways. So, yeah.
Here's a question from Sandra, and I think, Christopher, you talked a little bit about your previous work. Sandra says, big fan of your short story collection, Telling the Map. What are some of your favorite works of science fiction that unfold in rural spaces when so many science fiction futures take place in huge cities and cyberpunk dystopias or completely unpopulated frontiers? So there's like, there's not so much examination of the rural. It's one or the other. So what are some of your stories or favorite instances?
I became a science fiction writer because of one particular short story. I was always a fan of science fiction and fantasy, but I was also really into regional fiction in and around Kentucky and the Southeast in general. And I forever, as a young person, oscillated back and forth between these poles of diving all the way into dragons and outer space, and wanting to tell stories about my ancestors and the other peoples that lived where I lived and so on. And then one day I stumbled across a book by a man named Terry Bisson. It was a short story collection called Bears Discover Fire. And the title story was set in the median of I-65, about 70 miles from where I grew up. The story is about, by the way, bears discovering fire. It's also about elder care and family life, and the viewpoint, the narrator is a person who sells crop insurance, right, and who lives on a farm, and it just blew my mind. Every story in that collection actually blows my mind, but it just blew my mind that there was a path to be negotiated. And Terry Bisson, who is one of the most important living American writers in of any stripe, as far as I'm concerned. Eventually, I got the opportunity to know him and study under him, and he's actually one of the dedicatees of that collection. So, Bears Discover Fire, the collection. There's the answer.
Michael.
Maybe it's a genre that we really need to develop, agrarian science fiction. Call it that. I don't know, something like that.
What does that look like? What does an idealized agrarian science fiction genre look like?
Do you know much about utopias? I do not, I should say. But my impression is that the early utopian methods, going all the way back to Utopia, but also up through the 19th century, we have these people that lived here near the Shakers, right? And they were a utopianist movement. And they were agriculture up, down, all the way. I mean, they were also industrial, but so many utopias that I'm familiar with in the U.S., almost all of which died out, had very strong agriculture components, right?
So the collectivist movement in the 1960s,
which Terry Bisson was involved in.
Today, queer communities, where there's a strong movement now for creating rural queer communities. So I think there's you get this kind of bipolar sense of the rural as the backward, as the negative, and therefore urban capital can exploit it. Yet at the same time, there's also the sense of the rural as a space where new things can be created without the constraints of, urban state capitalism.
Great. All right. Let's get to it. So here's a question from Jonathan related to the parable of the tares. Why is big bluestem, the seed that Dana plants at the end, why is that plant so important to U.S. Midwest ecosystems?
It's complicated, but I did put it a little farther south than its main range, to be perfectly honest with you. But it was it's buffalo grass. It was it fostered a very complicated ecology in pre-modern times, and actually well into modern times. And it's a beautiful tall grass, and it fed the buffalo, which in turns, ecology is a knot. Any given environment is so multifarious and complex, which is why monocultures can't live, which they cannot exist. But from microbes through insects, through the birds that feed on the insects, through the pollinating insects that enable the flowering plants and the many different plants that exist in these kind of systems, to the larger animals that feed on it and on each other. Because it's a keystone creature, I guess. It's a keystone species is the reason I chose it. Plus it's 3 meters tall. And when the early Spanish explorers and French explorers were first riding through that part of the world, they would have to stand on their saddles to try to see forward as they work their way through the grass. And I think that's a great image. So
that's great.
Yeah, I think there. I wonder if there's some constraints of fiction and the length of the genre, and trying to make a point come together in very tight space. Because I think from an ecological point of view, it might have been better if she had a variety of seeds.
Oh, hell yeah. But that's Bob's fault, because he said 1,500 words, give me 90,000 and I'll do a little better job on the actual science.
That's fair. That's fair. So you're both involved in local politics, and you both sort of have a sort of similar background and set of skills. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how local politics play into imagining your future.
Yeah, your future, our future, the future. You said your future, Bob. I
or
don't know.
or a future, or any possible futures.
Mm,
Well,
absolutely.
it is my hope that that there's a flowering of local politics, because I don't think that international and corporate politics are any longer of much use to the people on the ground, and in fact actively work counter to their interests. So, you know, you get up towards governing too many people with too small a number of people, and you get in trouble, I think. And you know, I'm not advocating smashing the state. I'm advocating ignoring the state. I'm advocating rolling your own. I'm advocating getting down at the local level and addressing the problems that you have locally, and then the problems that you have nationally and internationally. I'm advocating addressing those locally as well. So that's.
Well, I totally agree with all of that. But I think one of the things that can help propel that along is if we can somehow overcome the very negative association we have with that very word, politics.
Oh, yeah.
Because really, politics is just people figuring out how to get along better with each other and with the planet. And how do we, that seemed to me a very good thing to try to figure out, right? And so we're all in different positions, we have different needs, we have different ideas. And so the goal is, how do we bring those different interests together in ways that build us all up, and those ideas that lead to more creativity. And starting at the local level seems to me to be a very good place to do that. But key to that, I think, is maybe overcoming this very, very negative association, maybe peculiarly American association that we have with the very word politics.
Mm-hmm.
All right, gentlemen, we are just closing in on an hour. As a, sort of a last question, Anna asks, what does this story have to say about community? So much of, I think, what we were trying to do with this series, right, is about community and connectedness and self-reliance. But, for you, what does this story say about community?
That they're multifarious, and that there's hope to be found within them.
And there's huge problems when you try to turn it into one thing.
Mm.
That's great.
I think sometimes we think of community as about bringing samenesses together, but no, it's about bringing differences together.
Fantastic. Great. This was excellent. Christopher, Michael, thank you so much. Christopher's story, if you haven't read it, and now you should feel compelled to read it, it's up on the Us in Flux website. That's csi.asu.edu/usinflux. The series is ongoing. This was our first story. Our next story is by Kij Johnson. It's a story called An Attempt at Exhausting My Deck. It will be published on Thursday morning, and then we'll be talking to Kij and a colleague, Jesse Rack, from the University of Arizona, and we'll be talking to them next Monday. So thank you for joining us for this event. Michael, Christopher, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we'll see you again very, very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight, truly.
Thanks all.